Welcome back to Revenge Codex. My name is Layla. I'm 31 years old. And the night everything broke open, I was sitting at a dinner table that wasn't mine, surrounded by people who had decided, long before the appetizers arrived, that I didn't belong there. I remember the exact moment it happened. Not because it was dramatic. Not because anyone raised their voice. But because of the silence that followed. That particular kind of silence that fills a room after someone says something cruel and everyone decides, collectively, to pretend they didn't hear it, except they did. Every single one of them did. His name was Marcus. My then-boyfriend's older brother. The kind of man who wears his confidence like a tailored jacket, always pressed, always visible, always just a little too loud in rooms where he suspects he might be questioned. We were 12 people around a long oak table at his parents' house. A family dinner. They called it. A welcome dinner. His mother had said on the phone. For me. The candles were lit. The wine was poured. His mother had made her famous lamb, and the whole house smelled like rosemary and something I couldn't quite name. Something warm. I had worn a green dress. I had brought flowers, white peonies, because I'd read somewhere that you bring flowers, not wines, when you want to make a genuine impression. I set them on the counter when I arrived. His mother smiled, said they were lovely, and put them in a vase in the hallway where no one would see them for the rest of the evening. That was the first sign. I didn't register it then. I was seated at the far end of the table, next to his cousin, a quiet woman named Dina who spent most of the meal looking at her phone, and across from Marcus, who spent most of the meal looking at me. Not the way you look at someone you're trying to understand. The way you look at something you've already decided is beneath you, but you're still watching to confirm it. The conversation moved the way family conversations do, easily, familiarly. Cutting across the table in shorthand I didn't have. Old jokes I didn't know. References to summers I hadn't been part of. I smiled when it seemed appropriate. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke, which I've always believed is the more intelligent position in a room you're new to. And then Marcus cleared his throat. He picked up his wine glass, turned it slightly in his hand, the way people do when they want the room to notice they are about to say something, and looked directly at me. So Layla, he said. My brother tells us you work inches, what was it? Event coordination, I said yes. I told him I ran a mid-sized events company. Corporate functions, primarily. Some private. We had 12 full-time staff. He nodded the way people nod when they are not listening, just waiting for their turn to respond. That's sweet, he said. The table didn't laugh. But it didn't correct him either. Sweet. I held my fork. I set it down carefully. I looked at him and said, thank you, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is the thing that gives nothing away. He continued. He talked about his own work, investment banking, which he mentioned 4 times over the course of the evening, and somewhere between the main course and dessert. He said the thing that I think about sometimes, even now. Not because it wounded me, but because of how precisely wrong he was. He was explaining some deal he'd closed, some number that was supposed to impress, and he gestured down the table toward me the way you gesture at a visual aid. And he said to his brother, not to me. Even though I was sitting right there, it must be nice for her. Honestly. Low stakes. Low pressure. Nobody depending on you for anything real. The table went quiet. And then his mother started talking about dessert. That's the part that stayed with me. Not what Marcus said, but the way the table moved past it. The way my boyfriend, David, whose hand I had been holding under the table, did not say a single word. The way Dina looked up from her phone for exactly 3 seconds, and then looked back down. Low stakes. Nobody depending on you for anything real. I sat with that for the rest of the meal. Not with anger, I want to be clear about that. I have never been particularly interested in anger. It's expensive. It costs more than it returns. What I sat with was something quieter. Something that felt more like recognition. I recognized what was happening. I recognized what kind of room I was inches. And I recognized, for the first time, the shape of a decision I hadn't known I was going to make. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone reduced you to a single sentence? Where all your years of work, all your actual complexity, collapsed in a stranger's mouth into something small and dismissible? Where you felt the table turn away, not violently, just quietly, like a door closing, and no one thought to hold it open. If you have, you already know what I'm about to describe. If you haven't, stay with me. Because what I did next was not about revenge. Exactly. It was about clarity. It was about finally deciding to let the truth be loud enough to speak for itself. Here's what Marcus and most of the table believed about me that night. That I was David's girlfriend, which is to say, an accessory. That I was young, which is to say, inexperienced. That I worked in events, which in his vocabulary was code for someone who arranged flowers and confirmed catering orders, and sent cheerful emails about dietary restrictions. He had constructed, in the space of one dinner, a complete and total fiction. And the most interesting part was that he had done it confidently. The way people do when they have never been seriously wrong about anything, or at least have never been made to feel the consequences of it. Here is what was actually true. I had started my company, Meridian Events, at 24, with $11,000 in savings, a laptop, and a contact list I'd built over 2 years of working for someone else. By the time I sat at that table, 7 years later, Meridian had managed corporate events for 4 Fortune 500 companies. Our largest single contract, a 3-day leadership summit for a global pharmaceutical brand, had a production budget of $2.3 million. We had won 2 industry awards. I had been invited to speak at a conference in Amsterdam the following spring. I did not say any of this at dinner. Not because I was ashamed of it. Not because I was performing modesty. But because I have learned, over years of watching how power actually operates, that the people who lead with their credentials are usually the ones who feel they need to prove something. I didn't need to prove anything to Marcus. Not yet. What I want you to understand about the years before that dinner is that it wasn't the first time. Marcus was just the most recent version of a pattern I had been living inside for most of my adult life. A pattern that had started much earlier, in much smaller rooms, with much quieter dismissals. My father was a man who believed that competence was masculine by default. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, particularly, but because he had grown up in a world that had confirmed this belief over and over again, and no one had ever required him to examine it. He was a civil engineer. Precise. Methodical. Proud. When I told him at 17 that I wanted to study business, he said, "That's a fine hobby." When I told him I wanted to start a company one day, he said, "You should find a good partner first." He meant a husband. He meant someone to carry the weight of the real ambition while I stood beside it. I did not find a husband first. I found a business plan. I found a mentor, a woman named Constance who ran a logistics firm and had the most organized mind I have ever encountered. I found a work ethic that I'm not sure I chose so much as inherited from the particular kind of hunger that comes from being told, repeatedly, that you are probably not quite enough. I worked for a company called Vertex Events from 21 to 23. My manager there was a man named Philip who gave me every detail-oriented, behind-the-scenes task available and every public-facing, credit-receiving opportunity to the 2 male coordinators on the team. When I raised this once, professionally, in his office, he told me I was maybe reading into things when one of those coordinators left and I assumed his accounts. Philip introduced me to a new client as our logistics support. I smiled. I took notes. I kept the accounts for 8 months, until I had enough credibility with 3 of those clients to take them with me when I left. That wasn't revenge either. That was just clarity about the shape of the room I was in, and a decision about whether to stay in it. I built Meridian carefully. I hired carefully. I chose clients carefully, not only for size, but for culture. I wanted to work with people who understood that excellence has no particular gender, and I was willing to stay smaller longer to find them. By year 3, I didn't have to stay smaller anymore. Now, let me tell you about David. David was not a bad person. I want to be precise about that, because this story is not about him being monstrous. He was warm, actually. Attentive in the early ways that matter. He remembered things I told him, books I mentioned, restaurants I said I wanted to try. He was the kind of man who noticed when you were tired before you said so. But David had a family, and families have architectures, power structures, hierarchies that operate below the surface of every conversation like underground water. And in David's family, Marcus was the current. The thing everything else moved around. David knew this. I suspect he had always known it. I also suspect that some part of him, not a cruel part, just a tired one, had decided long ago that the easiest way to survive Marcus was to never be the thing that Marcus turned toward. After that dinner, on the drive home, I waited. I waited to see if David would say anything. I watched the highway lights move across the windshield. I listened to the radio. I counted 11 exits before I accepted that nothing was coming. Your brother was unkind tonight, I said finally. David exhaled. That's just Marcus, he said. He's like that with everyone. He doesn't mean anything by it. He doesn't mean anything by it. That sentence. Remember it. Because that sentence, that particular construction, is one of the most reliable indicators I know of a person who has decided that someone else's comfort is worth more than your dignity. He doesn't mean anything by it means, I have decided the cost of addressing this is higher than the cost of your paintures. It means, I will ask you to absorb this, quietly, and not make it difficult. I said, okay, not because it was okay, but because I was done talking about it. I drove home inside that silence and I sat with it, and somewhere in the space between his exit and mine, something shifted. Something that had been oriented toward continuation, toward making this work, toward patience, rotated on its axis and pointed somewhere new. I didn't explode. I didn't cry. I made a cup of tea when I got home, and I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook. I've always thought better on paper, and I wrote one line at the top of the page. What do I actually know? And then I started writing. I wrote down everything I had observed at that dinner. Not the emotions, the data. The way Marcus positioned himself at the table. The way he referenced his work 4 times unprompted. The way he spoke about other people in their presence, as if they weren't quite present. The way the family moved around him, accommodated him, laughed at his pacing. I wrote down what David had said in the car. I wrote down what I had not said all evening. And then I wrote down one more thing. What would it look like if the truth were simply visible? That was the question. Not how do I hurt Marcus? Not how do I make him regret it? But what would happen if the actual facts were simply available? If the room he had constructed, with its tidy little fiction of who I was, were replaced by the room that actually existed? What would he do inside that room? I went to bed. I slept well. This is the part people always find strange when I tell it. But the decision felt clean. And clean decisions don't keep you awake. The first thing I did, in the weeks that followed, was nothing that looked like anything. I continued to attend family events. I smiled at Marcus when I saw him. I asked about his work. I let him talk, and Marcus always talked, given the invitation, and I listened with the particular quality of attention that most people mistake for admiration, but is actually just information gathering. I learned that Marcus worked for a firm called Aldrin Capital, that his particular specialty was mid-market acquisitions, that he had, over the past 18 months, been positioning himself for a senior partnership, that the person standing between him and that partnership was a managing director named Elise Hartwell, whom he referred to, always with a small, careful smile, as a very thorough woman. I learned that Marcus sat on the board of a mid-sized charity that held a very large annual gala, that the gala was considered a significant social event in certain circles, that in the past 3 years, it had been organized by a company called Prestige Collective, who had, as of 8 months ago, dissolved. The gala was 4 months away. The charity was still looking for an events company to take it. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking this was the plan, that I'd engineered this moment from the start. But that's not quite how it happened. What happened was that I had made a decision to be observant, to stay in the room long enough to understand it. And the room, being what it was, eventually showed me a door. I did not go after Marcus's gala. I went after it because Meridian was the right company for it, genuinely, objectively the right company, and because I had learned that in most rooms where power operates, the most effective thing you can do is simply be undeniably qualified. I had my business development director reach out to the charity's events committee. I had him present our portfolio, the pharmaceutical summit, the 3 tech conferences, the private foundation dinner we'd done in Copenhagen 2 years ago. I had him include testimonials, budget performance data, a brief on our sustainability framework, because I knew from Marcus's own words that the charity's new chair was focused on environmental credibility. 3 weeks later, I got a call. They wanted to meet. The meeting was at the charity's offices, a clean, quiet space in the financial district with large windows and very good coffee. There were 4 people on the committee, the chair, 2 trustees, and the events lead, a careful woman named Priya who asked the best questions. I presented alone. I had offered to bring my team, but I had a feeling, the kind of feeling you develop over years of reading rooms, that this committee wanted to see the person, not the company. They wanted to understand the judgment behind the portfolio. The meeting ran 90 minutes. It was supposed to run 45. At the end of it, the chair said, "I'll be honest with you, we've had a recommendation from one of our board members for another company. But I want to tell you that what you've shown us today is exceptional." I asked, professionally, who had recommended the other company. She paused, then said, "Marcus Webb." I kept my face entirely still. "I appreciate the transparency," I said. And then I said nothing else about it. What happened next was not something I arranged. I want to be very careful here, because the distinction matters. What happened was the natural consequence of things already in motion, things I had not set in motion, but had simply decided not to intervene inches. Marcus's recommendation was for a company called Peak Events. Small, recently launched, run by a friend of his from university. Their portfolio was adequate. Fine. Even. But it was not $2.3 million in production budget fine. It was not Fortune 500 fine. The committee reviewed both submissions. They chose Meridian. They informed Marcus via email. I know this because David mentioned it at dinner. 3 weeks later, a smaller dinner. Just the 2 of us. At a restaurant I liked. He said, "Marcus is a little put out. Apparently. Some charity thing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" I looked at him across the table. I took a sip of my water. "I run an events company," I said. "We bid on events." He looked at me for a moment. Then he laughed, a little uncomfortably, and changed the subject. That wasn't even the beginning. Here is what I knew about Aldrin Capital, the firm where Marcus worked. I knew that they had, in the past 2 years, expanded aggressively into a sector that required significant regulatory navigation. I knew that their compliance department had been flagged, not publicly, not yet, but in industry conversation, in the quiet language of people who track these things, for some procedural questions around 2 of their mid-market acquisitions. I knew this because I move in rooms that Marcus would be surprised to know I move in. Because while Marcus was sitting at a dinner table deciding that I was low stakes, I was sitting in boardrooms with the kind of people who know these things and say them openly, because they've decided I'm the kind of person worth saying them to. I did not leak this information. I did not make a call. I did not write a letter. What I did was introduce 2 people who already knew each other. Approximately. There is a journalist, I will call her R, who covers financial services for a publication that, while not the largest in the sector, is the one that people in the sector actually read. R and I had met at a conference 2 years earlier. We had stayed loosely in contact. She was working on a piece about compliance culture at mid-market acquisition firms, which she had mentioned to me over coffee 6 weeks before the charity committee meeting. And there is a compliance consultant, I will call him T, who had done some work with one of our pharmaceutical clients and had, over the course of that engagement, developed a detailed opinion about the state of due diligence practices at several firms, including one whose name began with A. I introduced R&T at an industry lunch that I hosted quarterly. The lunch had nothing to do with Marcus. It was a lunch I had been hosting for 4 years. R&T were both on the invitation list for entirely legitimate, separate reasons. They sat next to each other because the seating chart put them there. I placed the seating chart. The conversation they had was their own. The conclusions R drew from it were her own. The story she filed. 6 weeks later, a careful, thoroughly sourced examination of compliance culture at 3 mid-market acquisition firms, one of which was Aldrin Capital, was entirely her own work. Marcus was not named in the piece. I want to be precise about this. He was not named. The firm was. The practices under question were. The deals that Aldrin had structured in ways that warranted closer examination were documented with the kind of specificity that makes denial difficult. The senior partnership Marcus had been building toward was quietly put on hold while the firm conducted an internal review. This I learned from David, who heard it from Marcus himself, who called David apparently in some distress, late on a Tuesday night. David told me about the call the next morning. He was careful about it, the way people are careful when they're not sure what they're saying. He said Marcus seemed rattled, he said something about timing. I listened. I said that sounded stressful. David looked at me again with that particular look, searching, slightly uncertain, like a man who suspects he's missed something but can't locate what it is. I did not help him locate it. Now I need to tell you about the gala itself. It was held on a Friday evening in November, in a converted Victorian warehouse that we had transformed, and I used that word intentionally, into something that several guests described to me, afterward, as the most beautiful event they had attended in years. The ceiling was draped in dark fabric and hundreds of suspended lights that shifted slowly in colour throughout the evening, from warm amber during the reception to deep blue during the programme to a soft, warm white for the dinner. The tables were set with precision. The speakers were managed flawlessly. The technical production ran without a single visible error. I was there the entire night. Not front of house. I rarely am. At our events. I was in the production area, moving through the evening with the quiet focus that I think of as the truest expression of my work. The place where all the planning becomes invisible, and the only thing visible is the experience we've built. Marcus was there. Of course he was there. He was a board member. He arrived with his wife, a woman I had met once. Briefly. who seemed genuinely kind and slightly exhausted, and 2 colleagues from the firm who were, I gathered, being cultivated as potential donors. I watched him from the production area for a moment when he arrived. He looked well composed, the kind of composed that costs something to maintain. He didn't see me. Not at first. The charity's chair gave the welcome remarks. She thanked the committee. She thanked the sponsors. And then she said, in the particular, warm way of someone who genuinely means it, that none of what they were seeing would have been possible without the remarkable work of Meridian Events and their founder, Layla, who had taken this gala and turned it into something this organization would be proud of for years. She said my name clearly. In a room of 400 people. I was standing at the edge of the space, near the production entrance. I heard her say it. I saw several people at the nearest tables turn to look. And I saw Marcus turn. He turned slowly, the way you turn when you're not sure what you're about to see. And then he saw me. Standing in a black dress, earpiece in, tablet in hand, entirely at home in the room I had built. For a moment, just a moment, nothing moved in his face. And then something did. Something I recognized, because I have seen it before in other people in other rooms. The specific rearrangement of a face that is realizing, very quietly, that the story it had told about someone else was wrong. Entirely, thoroughly, undeniably wrong. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I turned back to my tablet, because there was a lighting queue in 4 minutes and my team needed to be ready. That was it. That was the whole moment. No confrontation. No speech. No visible victory. Just the room, and what it showed him. At the end of the evenings, as guests were departing, the charity's chair found me and embraced me and said, slightly tearfully, which I had not expected, that her late husband had founded this charity 20 years ago and that she had not seen it honored like this since his time. I thanked her. I meant it. Marcus left without speaking to me. His wife stopped by on her way out. She said, I don't know if you know my brother-in-law, but he clearly didn't know you. She smiled, not unkindly, and walked away before I could respond. In the months that followed, several things happened. The charity renewed with Meridian for the following year's gala and introduced us to 2 of their peer organizations, both of which became clients. The internal review at Aldrin Capital resulted in 2 senior departures and a restructuring of their compliance function. Marcus remained at the firm, but the senior partnership conversation did not resume. He was, from what I understood, reassigned to a team with a smaller profile. David and I ended things in January. Not because of any of this. Exactly. Or not only because of this, but because I had, somewhere in the course of these months, developed a very clear picture of the particular way David had chosen to move through his family and his life, always sidestepping, always accommodating, always choosing the path that kept the peace at the cost of other people's dignity. And I had decided that I was no longer interested in being one of those other people. He was surprised. He said he hadn't seen it coming. I believed him. Some people genuinely don't. I wished him well. I meant that too. The last time I saw Marcus was at an industry dinner, unrelated to any of this, in the way that things become unrelated once they've finished, about 8 months after the gala. He was there with colleagues. I was there with my business development director and 2 clients. He saw me across the room. He walked over. I want to tell you exactly what happened, because I think it's the truest end to this story. He walked over, and he extended his hand, and he said carefully, with the particular careful quality of a man constructing a sentence in real time, I think I underestimated you. I shook his hand. I looked at him with, I hope, the same precise calm I had held that entire year. Most people do, I said. And then I turned back to my clients, Because we were talking about something interesting, and I was not willing to give the remainder of the evening to a man who had taken enough of it already. Here is what I want you to know, sitting wherever you are right now. The thing that Marcus said to me at that first dinner, low stakes, nobody depending on you for anything real, was not about me. I understood that even at the time, in the part of me that was calm enough to observe rather than react. It was about him. About the architecture of a man who had built his identity on a hierarchy that required him to place others below it in order to feel stable at the top. People like that are not dangerous because they're powerful. They're dangerous because they're fragile. Because the story they are telling requires constant maintenance, constant confirmation that the hierarchy is real, that the people below them are actually below them. What I did was simply stop participating in the story. I didn't argue with it. I didn't perform against it. I didn't make it my mission to dismantle it. I just stepped outside of it. Did the work I was already doing, more visibly. Occupied the rooms I was already qualified to occupy, more deliberately. Connected the people who were going to find each other eventually anyway. And let the story fall apart under its own weight, because that is what stories built on false premises do when they're no longer actively protected. I think about that sometimes. How much energy Marcus spent protecting that story. How much energy I used to spend managing other people's comfort with who I was. How much I used to shrink, hedge, preface, apologize for taking up space I had earned. I don't do that anymore. Not because of Marcus. He was just the most recent version of something much older. But because there is a particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a diminished version of yourself for long enough that you finally set it down. And once you've set it down, you cannot quite remember why you were carrying it. My name is Layla. I'm 31 years old. I run a company that generates 8 figures in annual revenue. I have spoken in front of audiences on 3 continents. I have built something that employs 22 people, most of whom are extraordinary, all of whom know that what we do matters. And the night a man at a dinner table decided I was low stakes, that was the night I decided to prove him right. Not about me. About the stakes.